Spoiler alert, it's death related.
Internet, Death Daddy, Little D, Big D. Ready? Ladies and gentlemen, coming to the stage right now, Little D Death!
Woo! Yeah! Woohoo!
5, 4, 3, 2,
Counting really slow.
1.
Welcome and thank you for being here for this episode of DEATHinitely, the show that takes death seriously so you don't have to. I'm your host, Allison Danger, your internet death daddy, your catacombed craniumed, your parish putrefied pupil who's on a quest to learn everything about death and pass that knowledge along to you at the Thanatology Thesis of Life, the Knowledge Pod for your ears. On today's episode,
Big D and Little D Death. Is that a good way of saying the title of this episode, Allison?
I think so, yeah.
Semicolon, death.
And with me, as always, is producer-editor Jordan Middlebrook.
Apparently, I'm also narrator today.
Narrate me a podcast.
That's your job.
Aww. Host with the most.
Big host, little
Ghost. Aww.
host. There we go.
Trigger warning. DEATHinitely is a show that talks about death. This episode talks about different kinds of grief that are elicited by different methods of death. So please take care while listening.
Allison,
Yeah.
what is Big D and Little D death?
It's a fun and provocative way to describe death. It gets your attention in a way that's invoking of the Latto song Big Energy. You all know the one, BDE, but in this particular one, the D is death, not something else.
So it's big death energy.
Yes, so we're talking big D, big death energy, and little death energy.
Okay.
So big D and little D energy, or big D and little D death. We're talking about big grief or little grief. This nomenclature can be awfully misleading, giving it more or less weight to certain types of loss. But that's not how it was meant to be interpreted when these labels were put on types of grief, loss, or death. People love to categorize things, label, organize, and sift through things and put them into neat little groups. I'm sure there is an anthropological reason for all this, stemming from our latent ancestral needs of hunter-gatherer times, but in modern psychology, this is called cognitive categorization theory. The bonus of this ability of the human mind is that it helps us to store vast amounts of information that would otherwise take up way more space. We generally live longer and less snake-riddled lives by remembering that brightly colored snakes are usually more dangerous than their bland-colored brethren. Where we have failed as a species to develop with our globalization is that we use an ability to categorize objects and ideas and extend them to people. In the modern social or global construct, our built-in need to categorize people leads to things like prejudices, stereotypes, in-grouping and out-grouping, racism. Again, the list is long and terrible, but you get the picture. Putting people into columns, groups, or categories does more harm than good in modern times. Categorizing types of loss or grief, though, can be helpful. When we're talking about big death energy, BDE, we are talking about the loss of a person. Person is usually in our immediate lives or was at some point. Family, friends that are like family, relatives, teachers, students, mentors, or colleagues. There are multitudes of studies, books, groups, and therapies that are all built around or designed on the basis of loss that fits squarely into the big D death category. And why shouldn't there be? We all experience this kind of big D death. It's as the name suggests. It has a large impact on many facets of a person's life, and it's inevitably going to change you forever. So what about little D death then? What exactly is it? Well, academically, you could find it listed as an ambiguous loss. I kind of like the term little d here better because it reminds me of this like chibi-style Grim Reaper with a cherub-like skull and like a training scythe with like a protector on it. Like part death as a personification and part next up-and-coming music icon. You know, it's little d death. Ah, the teenagers scream, they go crazy. Woo.
So, I have to point out that while the show is meticulously researched, it is scripted. Let's be quite honest.
Yes.
We write things down so that we don't get lost in our train of thoughts.
We don't ramble.
I really wish that we had vetted this joke about the little D death. Teenager scream and the crowd goes wild.
You got the picture.
Yeah, I guess the point did.
You can
get
see him
across.
up there in his little black robe with his training scythe. It's like Bieber, but not.
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to the stage right now, Little D Death!
Woo! Yeah! Woohoo! Little D death is grief and loss of something that was never alive or not autonomous. Something like an idea, an action, ability, or a future. Little d death loss can be something as common as the loss of a friendship or going into menopause, which is the loss of the ability to reproduce. In speaking with a dear friend who recently had to have portions of their reproductive organs removed, there was a sense of sadness and grief in that loss. She already has 2 wonderful children, and her husband had already had a vasectomy. So there were never plans for any more kids. But she said that there was still a profound difference in the feelings between I don't want any more children and I can't have any more children. So little d deaths are the little things that die on us over time, but can often feel really, really big.
So, Allison, when coming up with the term for big D death, little d death, one thing I'm not aware of, is this something that you came up with?
It kind of piggybacks on the idea of when people are talking about trauma, sometimes they talk about big T and little t trauma, depending on how that trauma is experienced. So I just kind of extrapolated that idea and applied it to the death or grief construct.
Why is little death important to recognize and acknowledge?
Little d death is also called ambiguous loss in the grief literature. Experiencing grief from little d death is more common by far, but we don't usually have the social construct or setting available to us. Experiencing grief from little d death is more common by far, but don't usually have a social construct or setting that is available for them to be experienced. Thus, it can be very isolating and lonely to experience this form of loss. So let's talk a little bit about some of the most common forms of little d death or little d grief. Saying goodbye to a situation or a future goal, we can call this situational goodbyes. Loss or end of a job or a career. It changes our outlook and our futures. The end of a relationship, like divorce, friendships, estrangement, or even incarceration that fundamentally changes the way you interact with somebody. Then you can talk about the loss of physical or mental abilities or health, and the relationship to sickness or aging. While there are some groups for now, divorce support or living while a person you know or love is in jail, losing your job or losing a friend isn't often given the emotional space or social recognition people feel that it elicits or deserves. Grief literature uses 2 categories to describe types of little d death loss. It lumps these intangible losses into the complications surrounding the irregular loss of a person where there is no confirmed death. While these 2 things seem very different, they are classified together. The 2 following categories seem more like a subset of big D death grief for me than falling into this kind of catch-all category that seems to house everything other than straight up, straightforward losses of people. The first one in grief literature is when there is a psychological presence but no physical one. The second is when there's a physical presence and that remains, but the psychological one is gone. Again, this applies to loss of people in one way or another. An example of the first would be when somebody is presumed dead, like a missing person. A body or a physical presence is gone, but psychologically you haven't allowed yourself to grieve the person because you just don't know whether they're alive or dead. This applies to things like wartime, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, or kidnappings. It's the unknown. There's no physical proof of death. The second, when a physical presence still exists, but the person is no longer quote-unquote themselves. Alzheimer's, dementia, and many other progressive cognitive or degenerative disorders and diseases have a grip on this category. You could say that chronic addictive behavior or untreated mood disorders or mental disorders could impair a person's psychological presence too. Again, this is referred to as saying goodbye without leaving.
I have a quick question
Sure.
that I want to add. You spoke about how the physical, like you were referring to Alzheimer's and dementia and stuff like that. And you had mentioned chronic addictive behavior. Does that also include addicts?
Yeah, so the idea that when a person is active in their addiction, they're no longer themselves. They're high all the time, or they're whatever they're using that's feeding their addictive behavior makes them somebody other than their authentic selves. So it's a loss of the psychological of the person. You're losing a part of them. For the purposes of our podcast today, little d death and loss, or ambiguous loss, we'll look through that through the lens of the loss of something that was not living, or the loss of an abstract concept. Person's profound sense of loss and sadness that's not associated with death of a loved one. So these ones I've just spoken about here, where we're leaving without saying goodbye, or we're saying goodbye without leaving, we're going to move those up into the big D category because I feel like that's where they need to sit.
Allison?
Yeah.
Why do pet and animal death fall in the middle?
Well, they're a living thing. They're not a mental construct or an idea. They're not intangible, but they're not a person either. So a lot of times there's a lot of confusion as to where a pet loss will fall on the spectrum of grief. Should it fall into the big D death category, or should it fall into the little d death category?
It comes down to the person, individual.
Yeah, the relationship you have with the pet. Traditionally, it's not included in big D death losses. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak with the owner-operator of Pet Aftercare Toronto, an alternative disposition and aftercare for pets, familiar with the deathscape that surrounds pet loss, and an innovator in the region. We're about to listen to a conversation that I and Dan, the owner-operator of Pet Aftercare Toronto, have about this very topic.
So my name is Dan Millette. I am the owner and sole person that works for Pet Aftercare. My pronouns are he, him.
So I'm going to dive right in. You are running what people outside of the profession might call an alternative aftercare for pet passing or pet death. Side note, there are some academic studies that indicate that the loss of a pet can be for some people a catastrophic and mental health crisis. One particular study has developed a questionnaire that vets and other grief support groups for pet loss can use to pinpoint the level of grief being experienced by someone after the loss of their pet companion. This peer-reviewed and tested set of questions can help determine if your pet loss has entered a pathological state and you may need to seek professional help. Check out the link in the show notes. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how that works.
So I run Pet Aftercare Toronto. It's a alternative and ethical alternative to cremation or burial. Mainly I work with the bones or pelts for Pet Aftercare and kind of giving people something a little bit different other than cremation or burial to honor and memorialize their pets.
So you had a lot of displays at the Oddities and Curiosities Expo. So for our listeners, what we're doing is we're taking the bones and articulating them in a really aesthetically pleasing way. So it becomes, a shrine or a mourning or a display of the bones of the past pet. Is that accurate?
Correct, yeah.
Awesome.
I also work with pelts and wet specimens as well. So some ones like the heart. I also do mummification as well for like paws and stuff like that. So someone with a cat paw done as a keychain. But yeah, and anything that's a little bit different and alternative than what people are normally used to. Kind of giving people something a little bit different other than visiting a grave or having a box of ashes to be memorializing or mourning over for their pets. So it's something a little bit more tangible, something they can hold.
Yeah, the physicality of it is really, really fascinating because I think, people talk about human cremation and how it's on the rise from a traditional burial, but I think it allows people to do a lot more or explore the tangibility of somebody after they've passed away. So I'm really interested in the idea of having that tangibility that you provide outside of the idea of cremation, because not everybody is a cremation fan.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, very cool. When you're losing a pet, you're not necessarily losing a human, but you're still losing a loved one. So do you think it falls into that big D category? Do you think it falls into the little d category, which is more in line with intangible passing, like, the loss of a spouse, like a divorce, that is something that you would grieve? Or do you think it needs a category kind of all its own?
I believe with pets, all depends on the owner. I've been doing this for about 7 years. I worked at another company, and I've seen all types of all types of people, all walks of life come in and want to memorialize their pets. And it all depends on how someone perceives their pet. So for me, for example, the biggest death I've ever had in my life was my pet Lucy. She was a cat, Sphinx cat.
Yeah.
And she passed away at 4 years old, actually just over 3 years ago. It was on my 40th birthday.
Oh.
And that's been the death that's impacted me the most in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I had a cousin who was one of the closest people in my life pass away about 6 weeks earlier. And it was very, very hard, but it wasn't as impactful as my cat passing. So knowing that people, we come home or some people work from home and all they are surrounded by is by their pets.
Right.
So sometimes pet death can be the most traumatic and significant death in some people's lives. So knowing what I went through with my cat, she was in a freezer for about four or 5 months until I could really figure out what I really wanted to do with her. And just mourning and kind of not knowing exactly what I wanted to do, even though I had the option to be working on her skeleton, skull, any of that stuff. The place where I worked at, they offered to work on her for free, but I just couldn't bear to go through it. I originally had planned to have her skull and the rest of her cremated, but just in the end, I just decided to have her fully cremated. So everybody's, death affects everybody differently. Grief is something that you own. It's something that's yours. So I'm not ever one to tell people how they should grieve or memorialize their loved ones. So, but it can pet death can kind of fall either as a big D or a little D. So, with myself, I know with my pets, it will always be a big D.
Right.
I don't have children at all, and I won't ever have children. So these are my children. We spoil them like children. So
good. Knowing that you and your family work in the death care sphere or the grief sphere, why is the service you provide important to you?
Knowing what I went, this service is very important to me. Knowing what I went through personally with the death of Lucy, and the grief. You spoke previously about like psychosis and medication, hospitalization. At the time that she had passed, I can honestly say I lost my mind. It was very sick, but it was still unexpected. I was not expecting her to pass. I was in Montreal for my 40th birthday, and I had a cat sitter coming over to look after her. Yeah. And I got a call, and we were sitting down for dinner, about a quarter of the way eating my dinner, when I got a call that she was passing. And I literally lost my mind in front of 20,000 people. It was the first day that everything had lifted. COVID restrictions had lifted in Montreal. So there was about 20,000 to 40,000 people in the streets in the village in Montreal. Yeah. And at that point, I didn't see anybody. I literally just got up from the table and started screaming and running in the streets to who knows what. Right. I just went to a convenience store, grabbed 3 of the largest beers I could, and tried to medicate myself with alcohol to try and I guess relieve the grief.
Numb it a bit.
So, yeah, I can completely understand from the people that I've seen that I've worked with that people see their pets sometimes as children or as family members, as close as any other family member. So just being there to honor and to help memorialize and to give them back exactly what they want is my goal. And what I do is just making sure they have what they want to grieve and to memorialize their pets.
And I would say that the work that you're doing is another type of not non-medicinal, but it's not a medicine that you take, but it definitely does help with that process. It helps move through. And one of the big misnomers that I come across in my work, and I'm sure you've heard before, is I'm looking for closure. Well, that's the fallacy, right? There's never closure. You're never the same when someone's gone. You just learn to live with the fact that they're gone. So I would say that the work that you're doing is part of that medicine, is part of that growth, is finding a new way to be with this person, this pet, this member of your family in a different way, because the other way isn't available to us anymore.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Was there anything else that you found really helpful? I know you said you kept Lucy with you until you could really decide what you wanted to do. Were there any other ways that helped you work through your grief that you're comfortable talking about?
The morning after, my wife, she's in teacher training for yoga, Kundalini yoga.
Mm-hmm. Side note. Grief yoga has become a more popular way to work through some of the more difficult times of the grief process. My favorite grief yogi is practitioner Jenn. You can find her at heartshealing.me and on episode 17 of Grief Dreams, the podcast, streaming on Spotify.
The morning after that Lucy passed, we did a grief session with the Kundalini yoga, and that kind of not broke me out of the funk, but kind of helped me move on at least that morning for the hour. So to kind of stop crying and just like absolutely sobbing. So with that, it did help. She pulled up a Zoom pre-recorded a yoga session, and we did that for about an hour. It's a lot of breathing and kind of memorializing it as much as you can with that yoga session. So that did help with me. But I mean, everybody has different things. Either it's maybe, posting videos about your pet with, songs and stuff as well. It's grief is all personal, so it's kind of whatever you need to get through it, to hopefully move on to the next minute, hour, or day. But there's no right or wrong way that I've found, or way that I can really help people how to grieve and to move on, kind of things.
Do you think that because like society as a whole, or the actual grief sphere, is maybe looking at pet death in a way that is not so formal, do you think that makes it more difficult to have that social construct that pet death has the space socially to exist?
I'm finding it's definitely almost moving forward, and people are understanding a little bit more that it is such an impactful death on people. I found that there are grief groups now for pets. I actually donate a portion of my proceeds to an organization called RUFF. They help people with their pets. If someone's going into the hospital or some sort of situation where they can't be at home with their pets, that they'll take them in for a short period of time and help foster them for a short period of time, as well as they run a pet food bank for people that are marginalized community that need help feeding their pets. But then they also run a part of their organization is called HOWL, which is pet grief. And so they hand out kits with like candles and different kind of ideas and ways that you can help grieve, breathing methods and stuff. So I do find that now, and more than ever than I saw, 2 or 3 years previous, that there is being more recognition that pet death is a serious trauma to some people.
Absolutely.
So I'm just happy that there are groups out there that will help with people's pet death, instead of people thinking, are they crazy that they're crying a week after their pet has passed?
Right.
Don't listen to what other people say. Like, it's kind of more like, just do what you need to do to make it to the next day.
That's really good advice, I think, for anybody that's grieving anything, is give your grief space. It deserves the space it needs. It deserves, the construct that it gets and how it comes out of you, because I'm guilty of it myself. I work in death care. I've studied death. It surrounds a big portion of my life. And I am the absolute worst at, my daughter says, feeling my feelings. So that's the big takeaway today, I think, is feel your feelings. It's okay. Let it have space in your life, because it should and is part of it.
Everybody in this world will feel grief at some point in their life, whether it's the loss of a partner, through a relationship, or through death, loss of a job, many different reasons that we can feel grief. Some are more impactful than others, and it's about how you deal with it, and there is really not a rule book for it, so it's kind of how you deal with it.
And I don't think there's a comparison either. Somebody might feel the loss of their job in a way that's, tantamount to losing a spouse, because that was their life. They gave their life to their job. So it's not to say that, the loss of a pet should ever be compared to the loss of, a person or a thing or this or that, because depending on the life structure of the person, there's no comparison.
So I save up everything that's not used from pets, and we have a beautiful spot up north in Halliburton at my wife's family property that we bury them. We do a forest burial, lay some flowers down, burn some sage, and kind of say a couple prayers for them, kind of do like a small little ceremony. So just knowing that the pets are honored every single step of the way. I pray to St. Gertrude over the cat. She's a patron saint of cats. And it's not necessarily for anybody else, it's for myself and for the pet that's in front of me. I speak with them as I'm working with them, and try to be as gentle as possible. Like, it is not necessarily rough work, but I am putting a knife into an animal. So, when I flip them over or anything like that, if they accidentally bang something, I apologize to them. So I speak with them all throughout the way, and just making sure that they deserve the respect and dignity that they did in life, and death as well. So.
That's really cool. And I'm a practicing embalmer and have been for about 20 years. So it's really nice and so comforting to hear to hear you speak about that in a different realm, because it's exactly what happens in my embalming suite is, it's whoever happens to be on my table that day. And some of the things that I have to do are not necessarily, I wouldn't classify them as gentle, but they're a means to an end that a family or a deceased person wants. You're the advocate for that person that can't advocate for themselves anymore. So it's very much a caregiving position, as you're caring for that pet, you're caring for that bereaved family. So it's really nice to hear that, and I find myself talking to dead people all the time, oh, come on, Graham, like up you go, let's get dressed. And because one, I'm down there by myself most of the time, so I don't have very many people to talk to, but again, it humanizes the work that you do. And in this case, I don't know that humanize is the right word, but it brings you closer, it brings you that construct of caring. And I think that's so, so important. So that's really cool. It's really cool to see that correlation. Again, correlating it to being a member of your family, Canada is now getting involved in things like MAID, so medical assistance in dying. And I think that's a realm that's been around and has been explored for a longer period of time in pet death, that we have to make the choice sometimes to put our pets down. So, and to not be able to have that conversation, to know what they want. We don't have that ability. So I think there's probably, and I'd have to look into it and look at the data or the research, but there's probably a correlation between that, right? Like some people just aren't comfortable being that deciding factor, whether it's a loved one, a spouse, a pet, whatever. They can't bring themselves to make that decision. So it's nice to know that you're very fluid in that realm, that you don't place that judgment on people of what they're capable of in that, pre-death period.
And like looking back on pictures of like my cat Lucy, like weeks before she passed away, and seeing how thin she was, I never got a proper diagnosis for her. But she was jaundice, and it was most likely liver cancer. Yeah. Looking back at the way that she was now in pictures, the way that she was, it kind of blows my mind that I didn't choose euthanasia for her.
Right.
But knowing the way my mentality was at the time, I don't think I would be able to go through with it. But knowing what I know now, if my pets were like that, now my current pets, it's kind of almost recognizing the signs, and it's learning from the past and what you've gone through in the past.
Of course. Yeah. What is the hardest part of your job?
I mean, everything is hard about it. I'm a huge cat lover. I love cats. They're my favorite animals in the world. So it's just seeing the grief on people, seeing the grief in people's eyes, and knowing the weight on their heart, because I have felt it so heavily in the past. That is definitely the hardest part is seeing grief, but it is part of death. I think one of the harder parts, though, is not seeing the grief when people are just. I have had people just drop off animals at my old position where, like, I don't care really what happens, just do it, kind of. And it's kind of more of like, then it's seen as like an oddity in their cabinet kind of thing, and compared to a family member. Also, putting the first cut into an animal, I find is usually the hardest part. Some animals, it just takes me a while to actually get started. I used to have a rule that I don't meet animals before I work on them, because I don't really want have my last memory of them, seeing them alive, and then the next thing they're on my table.
Right.
And the rule was I don't work on Sphinx cats. They were my absolute favorite animal. And then I had a good friend whose 21-year-old Sphinx passed away. Wow. And she asked me if I could work on him, and I basically broke both those barriers within the first week I started independently.
Yeah.
So I went to a friend's place in Hamilton, and we had to put down her dog. But I was with the dog all along the car ride up, and I was there when it was euthanized. So I broke that boundary, which I find was something I would have needed to do. So I have been to a few euthanasias for pets in the last year or so. And I kind of just like being there and available. I usually won't be in the room with them, just because I tell them this is their time to say goodbye. I don't want to be any sort of being in any sort of way for what they need to do. If they really want to be there, then I can. But I'm not that good with death itself.
Right.
Kind of the there. Yeah. So it's hard all around. Those are definitely some of the aspects that are a little bit harder.
How do you process that? Are there any tips, tricks, or anything else that you could impart to anybody that's listening how you process working in that position?
So for the 6.5 years or so that I worked at my other position, I would literally cry the whole entire time working on someone's pet. Doesn't matter what kind of pet it was. I would just literally cry for the 2.5-3 hours that it would take me to work on the pet before it goes into different steps. And then I would go home and drink myself till I fell asleep, basically blacking out almost every single night. I've been sober for about 6 months doing this.
Good for you.
So I try not to take on other people's grief as my own, and I look at my sobriety as an honor to these pets, that I'm doing this clear-minded, clear-headed, and with a full heart, that I'm helping people with their animals. So now it's talking about it. My wife also works in the death industry, death circle, so she understands a lot about grief and stuff. So just having someone to talk to, and just knowing that I'm honoring them as much as I can. Finding
the beauty in what you can't change.
Exactly, yeah. And I try to work as fast as possible to get their animals back. So I usually have about a 6 to 8 week window that I try to work within to get their pets back, so that they're not waiting for 6-8 months for them to be getting an animal back. Just getting them back as quick as possible, so they can have them back in their home and memorialize them. Make a small little altar, or just having them out on their cabinet, or whatever it is that helps them move on with their grief.
Amazing. Well, good on you. I'm floored and in awe of your dedication, both in and out of the workspace. You've given your life truly, how you operate, your ethics, your morality to the loss of these pets. And that's so rare and so wonderful. So thank you for everything. You can find the link to Through Rough Times and Howl, Howl, in the show notes.
Allison, what are you reading?
I'm slowly reading a young adult fiction novel called Scythe. It's the first book in a 3-part series that takes place in a world where natural death no longer occurs. To keep the global population from overcrowding, people are appointed to be scythes to kill people according to the regulations of this world.
Wow, that sounds like a really good book.
You'd probably like it. I've also been seeking out some terror management theory papers, as well as listening to a podcast called the Death Studies Podcast. It's an academic endeavor to share information in the death research and academia space. Spoiler alert, it's death related. Link in the show notes because it's quite great. Jordan, what are you up to these days?
Well, Allison, I continue to be the host of By the Wayside, a show whose mission statement is to connect the audience, that being you or anyone else that's watching, to creativity.
Awesome.
Slash creative people. We actually had a podcaster on.
Ooh,
and
tell me.
I will tell you who the podcaster is. It was Allison Danger.
Oh, snap.
I know that show exists, so if you head to waysideshow.com, you can find that episode and watch you and I talking about
the podcast.
This podcast.
Definitely.
And it's definitely an amazing little episode there. So I would recommend people go and check out By the Wayside, the show that I host at waysideshow.com.
And you actually get to see us interact and be silly with one another as opposed to just listen to it. You can find episodes of Deathinitely on Spotify or Patreon. And don't forget to subscribe or sign up so I can keep all the sound glands filled with death knowledge noise. Jordan hated earballs and a couple of other things I said, so I tried sound glands to see how he liked it, and I got a real screwed up, grossed out face.
So on the next episode, we will not even be using we're not going to use this at all. Never again.
A big thank you to our listeners and our guests today. Deathinitely wants to take death seriously so you don't have to, creating a safe and inclusive space that tackles the mundane, profound, and crazy parts of death that you don't feel like asking anywhere else. Listen, participate, comment, love, learn. I'm just happy you're here. Our next episode is going to discuss the biology of death, or necrobiology. It's a cool handle. Deathinitely is an independent show that is recorded on the ancestral homes of several Mississauga and Chippewas First Nations. We honor these Indigenous peoples, ancestors, and future generations on this land that we share with reverence and humility. I'm your host, Allison Danger, and with me as always is editor-producer Jordan Middlebrook, with music by Soundbay. Links to reading and research materials as well as citations can be found in a link in the show notes. I'm Allison Danger, and this is Deathinitely, the show that takes death seriously so you don't have to. If you like what you hear on Deathinitely and want to know more, check out the show notes for all the social connections and things like citations, links, and other internet word noise. You can find us on Instagram, Spotify, and Patreon. Check out Deathinitely Pod on Instagram, search Deathinitely on Patreon and Spotify. You can also find us at AllisonDanger.com/DEATHinitely. DEATHinitely is an independent show that is made possible by generous people like you. If you want to know all the things, fun, funny, or funereal, please be sure to subscribe on Spotify, or you can join our mint condition Fresh Out of the Box Patreon for the show and all the goodies that come with it. Peace.
Don't say peace.
Bye.
That's better.
Hello.
Next time.
And cut.
Okay.